Inside the prison camp in the United States, during the final years of the war, I experienced something I could never have imagined. We were marched into a small room, one by one, and there they stood. American women in plain uniforms, holding scissors and clippers. They were not nurses, not guards, but barbers, female barbers, assigned to cut our hair. I had spent months in the steaming jungles of the Pacific. My face was hidden under layers of stubble, my hair matted with dirt, sweat, and blood. To us, hair was not just appearance. In the Imperial Army, it carried meaning. It was proof of our endurance, of sleepless nights, of battles survived. And yet here I was, sitting in a chair, forced to let the enemy, foreign women no less, trim it neatly away. My face burned with shame. Some of my comrades sat stiffly, their fists clenched. Others trembled as if they were being punished. What to the Americans was a simple act of hygiene. To us felt like humiliation deeper than anything we had endured in battle. But this was only the beginning. To understand how such a moment could cut so deeply, I have to take you back to the year 1944, when the Pacific War was reaching its most brutal stage. By then, the tide had turned. We lost island after island, Guam, Saipan, the Philippines. American bombers ruled the skies. Submarines strangled our supply lines. We were left isolated, starving, our strength drained by hunger and disease. Units collapsed. Friends fell beside me. Thousands of us faced the one outcome we had been taught all our lives to reject. Surrender. Surrender was not just defeat. It was shame. From the first day of training, we were told capture was dishonor, worse than death. We were raised to believe that true soldiers would rather fall on their own sword than let themselves be taken. And so, when I was finally surrounded and forced to lay down my rifle, I felt my life had ended. My honor was gone. I was no longer worthy of my family, my country, or my emperor. Then came the voyage. We were herded onto ships bound for America. The holds below deck were dark and suffocating. We lay packed together, shoulder to shoulder, sleeping on wooden planks slick with sweat. Buckets served as toilets. The air stank of sickness. Men coughed through the night, groaning with fever and hunger. Some muttered prayers. Others simply stared into the dark. Meals were barely enough to survive. Thin soup, stale bread. Many were too seasick to eat. Salt water sprayed through the open hatches, soaking our rags. I remember one man beside me burning with malaria, his body shaking violently. We tried to keep him alive, but we had nothing, no medicine, no food to give. Above deck, under guard, we caught fleeting glimpses of the ocean. Endless water, horizon in every direction. It was a reminder that we were being carried far from home, to the enemy's land. None of us spoke much. We didn't need to. Each of us believed the same thing, that America meant cruelty, starvation, and death. I remember whispering to myself one night, "This ship is not taking me to a prison. It is taking me to my execution." Every mile eastward felt like another nail hammered into the coffin of my honor. When the shoreline finally appeared, I could hardly breathe. America, the enemy's homeland. We shuffled down the gangways, rifles pointed at our backs, barbed wire gleaming in the distance. My heart pounded with dread. I braced myself for beatings, for humiliation, for the torment we had been told to expect. But what awaited us behind those gates was not what we feared. It was something stranger, and in many ways, far harder to endure. When the ship finally docked, the order came for us to move. We staggered down the gangway in long columns, our legs weak after weeks in the hold. Armed guards lined the pier, their rifles pointed steadily at us. We expected jeers, curses, even blows. None came. The soldiers barked orders in English, short and sharp, and we obeyed, shuffling forward. The docks were massive, crowded with cranes and warehouses. I had never seen such scale before. America, the enemy's land, stretched out in steel and concrete. My heart felt heavy in my chest. I thought, this is where it ends. We were marched into a large building. Inside, the process began. Each of us was assigned a number, our names recorded in thick ledgers. Photographs were taken, our faces captured forever on small cards. It was mechanical, efficient. The guards barely looked at us as men, only as entries to be logged. It struck me. They were not here to humiliate us, but to process us. That was the first shock. Then came the food. Bowls of stew, bread and coffee were set before us. I stared at mine, suspicious. Could this be poisoned? Was it some cruel trick? But hunger gnawed at me. I raised the spoon, and the warmth filled my mouth. It had been months since I had tasted food like this. My body trembled. Around me, some men ate greedily, others hesitated, but all of us felt the same astonishment. Our enemy was feeding us. Medical examinations followed. American doctors checked our wounds, peered into our eyes, and pressed cold stethoscopes against our chests. Bandages were applied. Pills handed out. I saw one of my comrades with a festering infection finally have his arm cleaned and wrapped. Another, burning with malaria, was given quinine. We had expected neglect, even torture. Instead, we were treated like patients. It was not kindness in the way we understood it. It was procedure. But even as procedure, it was shocking. From there, we were marched under heavy guard to the camp itself. The gates loomed ahead, strung with barbed wire. Guard towers rose above the fences, rifles glinting in the sun. My stomach turned as we stepped through. I braced myself for the dungeon I had always imagined. Dark cells, chains, filth. But inside, I saw something different. Rows of wooden barracks, clean and orderly, stretched out in neat lines. The ground was swept. Pathways were clear. There were kitchens, latrines, even open fields. It looked less like a prison and more like a military training post. The guards were strict, their eyes sharp, but the place was organized, structured, almost civilized. The biggest shock came when officers and enlisted men were thrown together. In Japan, rank was sacred. An officer was obeyed without question, treated with reverence. But here it meant nothing. Captains and privates stood in the same line, ate the same food, slept in the same barracks. I watched Japanese officers stiffen with rage, their dignity stripped away. Some tried to protest, but the Americans ignored them. To the guards, we were all the same, just prisoners. That night, I lay in a bunk with real sheets. Sheets. I had not seen such a thing since before the war. My body, still sore from the voyage, sank into the mattress. But I could not sleep. My mind raced. Where was the cruelty? Where were the punishments? Instead, there was a schedule. Lights out at a certain hour, meals at a certain time. Roll calls every day. The enemy was controlling us not with whips, but with order. It unsettled me more than beatings ever could. Pain I could endure. Death I had already accepted. But this strange world of rules, schedules, and routine stripped me of something deeper. It forced me to question everything I had been taught. As I lay there in the dark, listening to the quiet breathing of hundreds of other men, I realized the war had taken me into a place I did not understand, and the shocks were only beginning. A few days after our arrival, we were marched into a long building near the center of camp. None of us knew what waited inside. We shuffled forward in silence, the guards pushing us along with curt commands. When my turn came, I stepped through the doorway and froze. Lined up against the wall were several American women. They wore simple white uniforms, their sleeves rolled neatly. In their hands were scissors, combs, and electric clippers. I felt my stomach tighten. They were not nurses. They were not guards. They were barbers, female barbers. The order was clear. We were to sit down, one by one, and have our hair cut. I cannot describe the rush of shame that flooded me. Months in the jungle had left my hair thick, greasy, tangled with sweat and dirt. To us, that hair was not filth. It was a mark of survival. It showed the battles endured, the marches suffered, the nights without sleep. In our military culture, hair was not vanity. It was proof of hardship, of sacrifice. And now it was being stripped away. Not by my comrades, not even by enemy soldiers, but by women. I sat stiffly in the chair, my jaw clenched. The woman behind me placed her hand firmly on my head, tilted it forward, and the clippers buzzed to life. The sound alone cut through me like a blade. With each pass, clumps of hair fell onto the floor. My face burned red. I dared not look up. Around me, I saw my comrades react in different ways. One man shut his eyes tight, refusing to move. Another trembled, his fists white on the armrests. A few tried to sit tall, pretending it did not matter, but the color in their faces betrayed them. We were warriors, stripped of what little dignity remained, by hands we had been taught should never touch us. For the Americans, it was nothing. A simple act of hygiene. They wanted us clean, presentable, free of lice. But for us, it was humiliation deeper than any blow. When my turn was finished, I looked down at the pile of hair at my feet. It felt as though part of my identity had been thrown away with it. I touched my head. It was bare, light, foreign. I hardly recognized the reflection in the mirror propped against the wall. That night, as I lay in my bunk, the feeling lingered. We had been trained to endure pain, to die without fear. But no training had prepared us for this, for being treated like children, for being made subjects of women's hands, for losing even the right to keep the marks of our own suffering. Some officers whispered angrily in the barracks. They said this was a tactic to break us, to humiliate the Japanese soldier. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps that was the point. But in truth, it was more than humiliation. It was disorientation. The enemy had not beaten us with whips or starved us into submission. They had sat us down, shaved us, and sent us away clean. That was harder to bear. In the following days, every time I passed a guard, I felt exposed, as if the short bristles on my head marked me as weak. My comrades avoided mirrors. We kept our eyes down, but the memory of those buzzing clippers, of the quiet hands moving across our heads, stayed with us. Even now, so many years later, I can still hear that sound, the sharp buzz, the clumps of hair hitting the floor, and the low hum of shame inside my chest. That was the first true lesson of the camp. The Americans would not control us with pain. They would control us with order. And we were only beginning to see how far that order would reach. It was maybe a week after the haircuts when the next surprise came. The mornings had settled into a routine. Roll call at dawn, breakfast in the mess hall, then some form of labor or instruction. By then, I thought I had begun to understand the rhythm of the camp, but one morning after we lined up in formation, the guards gave a different order. Instead of marching us to the yard or the work details, they herded us toward a low wooden building near the center of camp. I did not know what to expect. Some men muttered that it might be another medical inspection. Others feared punishment. My stomach knotted as we drew closer. When we entered, the sight stopped me cold. The room was bright, filled with long wooden tables and benches. At the far end stood a counter, behind which Americans, some men, some women in aprons, were serving drinks and food, and there was music. A radio played softly, filling the air with the voice of a singer I did not know. The melody was smooth, comforting, unlike the harsh drum marches we had grown up with. It sounded almost careless, as though the world outside the camp was not at war at all. I could not move at first. My comrades crowded behind me, just as stunned. We were in what looked unmistakably like a café. The guards motioned sharply. We were to sit. Hesitantly, we shuffled to the benches, the sound of boots on the wooden floor echoing in the silence. None of us spoke. None of us understood what this meant. Moments later, steaming cups were placed in front of us. Dark liquid, rich and bitter-smelling, filled the air with a scent I had never known. Coffee. I stared down at mine, suspicious. Back home in Japan, tea was what we knew. Coffee was foreign. Western. I had heard the word, but I had never drunk it. Now here it was, set before me by the very enemy I had been trained to hate. Some of the men refused to touch theirs, folding their arms tightly. One officer shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. Another man, thin from fever, brought the cup to his lips with trembling hands. He winced, but kept drinking. I could not resist. Hunger and curiosity overcame suspicion. I lifted the cup and took a sip. The taste was sharp, bitter, and it burned down my throat. At first, I almost spat it out. But then came the warmth, spreading through my chest, down into my stomach. It was strange, even unpleasant, yet comforting at the same time. My hands trembled as I set the cup down. Then came the bread, soft, fresh, with a faint sweetness. It was nothing like the moldy rations or half-cooked rice we had eaten on the islands. The contrast was too much. I chewed slowly, my mind spinning. This was not survival food. This was indulgence. Around me, reactions varied. Some men ate quickly, unable to stop themselves. Others sat rigid, their cups untouched. A few broke into tears, silently wiping their faces with their sleeves. The shame of it was unbearable. To be treated like customers by the enemy, to be handed warmth and sweetness when we expected chains and whips. I remember whispering to the man next to me, "Why are they giving us this?" He shook his head, staring at his bread. "To make us weak," he muttered. Another comrade leaned closer, his voice low but steady. "No. To show us how strong they are. They can feed us like this because they have endless supply. That is their power." The words stung. I looked around the room again. The Americans behind the counter moved easily, almost casually, as if serving us was no different than serving their own soldiers. Their faces were unreadable, not cruel, not kind, just efficient. To them, we were not enemies anymore. We were prisoners to be managed. The music drifted through the air. Later, I would learn the voice belonged to Bing Crosby. At the time, it was only strange, foreign, yet haunting. I could not stop hearing it in my head even after we left. I thought back to the jungles of Saipan. I remembered scooping rainwater from leaves, gnawing on raw roots, swallowing whatever insects we could catch to stay alive. And now, here I was, holding a cup of coffee, the bitter taste still on my tongue, in a room that felt almost civilized. The contrast was unbearable. That night in the barracks, arguments broke out. Some men vowed never to drink that foreign liquid again. "It is poison to our spirit," one officer spat. "They are trying to wash Japan out of us." Others, quietly, admitted they looked forward to it. "It warmed me," one soldier confessed. "It made me feel human again." I said nothing. I could still taste the coffee, could still hear the song on the radio. I could not decide what it meant. All I knew was that, for a brief moment, I had forgotten I was a prisoner, and that frightened me more than chains ever could. In the days that followed, we learned the Americans called it the canteen, or the PX. To them, it was ordinary, a place for small comforts. To us, it was a crack in the wall of our beliefs. Every sip of coffee, every crumb of bread forced us to question what we thought we knew about the enemy, and about ourselves. Even now, decades later, I can close my eyes and see that room. I can smell the coffee, hear the music, feel the rough grain of the wooden table under my hands. Of all the shocks captivity gave me, that moment in the camp cafe remains one of the sharpest. It was a few weeks after the cafe incident when the next surprise came. By then, I thought I had seen enough of American strangeness. Women with clippers cutting our hair, music and coffee in a camp canteen. But I was wrong. Another shock awaited, one that felt even more personal because it touched the clothes on our backs. In the jungle, our uniforms had become part of us. They were tattered, stained with mud, sweat, and blood. We had worn them for months without change. When a seam ripped, we tied it with vines or string. When cloth rotted, we patched it with scraps torn from the dead. Washing meant beating the fabric in river water, if water could be found, and letting it dry stiff in the sun. The smell never left. Smoke from fires, rot from the jungle, the sour stench of unwashed bodies. Those uniforms were our armor, our suffering, our shame. One morning the guards ordered us to strip. Confused, we obeyed. We handed over our filthy uniforms, expecting punishment or destruction. Standing half naked in the chill air, we huddled together, exposed and uneasy. Then, men with carts collected our clothes, each bundle marked with numbers. We watched as the carts were wheeled away toward a building that belched steam from its roof. We whispered among ourselves. "What are they doing?" one man asked. "Burning them?" another muttered. An officer shook his head grimly. "They want to shame us. We will be left naked like animals." Hours later, the carts returned. What they carried stunned us. Our uniforms, our same uniforms, were folded neatly, pressed flat, and smelling of soap. The stains were gone. The cloth was lighter, fresher, as though reborn. Each set was handed back with precision, numbers checked, bundles matched. I lifted mine to my face. A wave of unfamiliar fragrance filled my nose, sharp, clean, chemical, yet almost sweet. I closed my eyes and breathed in. For the first time in months, my clothes did not stink of rot and sweat. They smelled pure. Around me, reactions varied. Some men clutched their bundles tightly, as though afraid they would be taken away again. Others laughed nervously, shaking their heads in disbelief. One man buried his face in his shirt and began to sob quietly. Another held his trousers up to the light, marveling at the absence of stains. I slipped into the uniform. It felt different, lighter on my skin, almost alien. I no longer carried the jungle with me. I no longer bore the outward marks of hardship. For a moment, I felt clean, and that, more than anything, unsettled me. Later, we learned the Americans had machines, enormous machines, that could wash dozens of uniforms at once with hot water and soap. They called them laundromats. We were told our clothes would be collected, washed, dried, and returned on a schedule. To the guards, it was routine. To us, it was unbelievable. That night, lying in a bunk with clean clothes against my skin, I could not sleep. The fabric itched, not from dirt, but from the strangeness of cleanliness itself. My body had grown used to filth. My mind had grown attached to it as proof of suffering. Now, that proof was gone. Some officers cursed softly in the barracks. "This is their trick," one said. "They want to strip us of our pride, make us soft, make us forget what it means to endure." Another added, "If we smell like them, eat like them, dress like them, soon we will think like them." Perhaps they were right. But part of me could not deny the relief. I no longer carried the crawling lice in my seams. I no longer reeked of decay. My skin, freed from months of grime, breathed easier. For the first time since the war began, I felt the comfort of cleanliness. And with that comfort came guilt. The guilt cut deep. How could I, a soldier of the Emperor, take pleasure in what the enemy gave me? How could I feel gratitude toward those who had destroyed our armies, bombed our cities, killed my comrades, Each time I inhaled the scent of soap, I felt torn between shame and relief. One memory remains vivid. A fellow prisoner, a man who had once been fierce on the battlefield, sat on his bunk holding his clean shirt. He stroked the fabric slowly, as if it were something sacred. Then he said in a low voice, "I had forgotten what it meant to be human. This reminds me." His words echoed in me for days, because in truth, he was right. The laundromat was not kindness. It was order. It was part of the American system: cleanliness to prevent disease, efficiency to maintain discipline, routine to control the masses. But for us, men who had been stripped of everything, it also became something else. A reminder that we were still human beings, not beasts. And that reminder was both a blessing and a burden. When I close my eyes even now, I can see the steam rising from that building, hear the clatter of carts, smell the sharp scent of soap clinging to my uniform. It was not a whip, not a rifle, not a blow that broke us. It was the simple act of having our clothes washed and returned as if we mattered. That was the power of the Americans. They did not need to starve us or beat us. They managed us with rules, with routine, with order so absolute it seeped into our very skin. And in that order, we began to lose something more dangerous than pride. We began to lose the belief that the enemy was only cruel. By the time weeks had passed inside the camp, I realized that the shocks we experienced were not isolated events. The haircuts, the canteen, the laundromat, none of these were accidents. They were part of a larger system, a system that clashed violently with everything we had been taught as soldiers of Japan. In the Imperial Army, suffering was proof of strength. Dirt, hunger, and pain were badges of honor. To endure without complaint was to show loyalty to the emperor. Even our training had taught us to ignore comfort, to embrace deprivation as the path of the warrior. We had been told again and again, the enemy would break us with cruelty, and our task was to resist until death. But here in the American camps, the opposite was true. The guards did not strike us. They did not starve us. Instead, they controlled us with food, with order, with rules that gave us more structure than we had ever known in the jungle. They insisted we be clean, well-fed, and rested. They forced us to live like soldiers again, though no longer in service to Japan. This created a rift among us. In the barracks at night, arguments broke out. Some men whispered angrily that the Americans were softening us on purpose. "Every cup of coffee you drink, every clean shirt you wear, is a nail in the coffin of your spirit," one officer growled. "Do not accept their gifts. Resist them, even if it is only in your mind." Others disagreed. "What good is pride if it kills us?" Another soldier snapped back one night. "I will drink their coffee. I will eat their bread. At least I am alive to taste it." The tension was constant. Some men refused to shave or bathe, clinging to filth as a final act of defiance. Others complied eagerly, even gratefully, relieved to shed the weight of dirt and lice. I watched friendships strain and loyalties crack. For myself, I was torn. I remembered the jungle. I remembered the nights without food, the fever that nearly killed me, the comrades who died with flies buzzing on their wounds. And I could not deny the relief I felt each time I lay down in a clean bunk or pulled on fresh clothes. My body felt stronger, my mind clearer. But every comfort carried guilt, a reminder that I was betraying the code we had lived by. One night, I sat with a group of prisoners, our voices hushed in the dark. "They want us to forget who we are," said Nakamura, an older sergeant. "They want us to become like them." I shook my head. "No, they don't care who we are. We are not men to them, only numbers. It is not kindness, it is order." He glared at me. "Order is the same as control. Do you not see? They are turning us into animals that obey the bell. Another man sitting nearby spoke softly. I do not care what they want. When I drink their coffee, I remember home. When I wear clean clothes, I remember my wife. It makes me human again. His eyes glistened. Oh, do you want me to give that up? The barracks fell silent. None of us had an answer. In the weeks that followed, I noticed more changes. Men who had once walked with heads bowed now began to talk, to laugh even. Some joined classes the Americans offered, learning English words or studying farming techniques. Others played games on the recreation fields, kicking balls across the grass. I watched them with unease. Was this survival or surrender of the spirit? One afternoon I caught my reflection in the polished window of a camp building. My hair was trimmed neatly. My face was clean-shaven. My uniform smelled of soap. For a moment, I did not recognize myself. The man staring back looked less like a beaten soldier and more like someone who had never fought at all. I pressed my hand against the glass and felt tears sting my eyes. Had I lost the last piece of who I was? Yet I could not deny another truth. I felt alive. Health returned to my body. The cough that had racked me for weeks was gone. My skin no longer itched with lice. My strength grew, even as my spirit wavered. The clash was not only among us. It was within us, between loyalty to suffering and the undeniable relief of order, between the pride of filth and the shameful gratitude of cleanliness, between the warrior I had been trained to be and the human being the Americans insisted I remain. Decades later, when I look back, I realize this was the true battlefield of captivity. Not the fences, not the guards, not the barbed wire. The battle was inside us. The Americans never struck us, yet they forced us to confront a truth we could not accept. That strength could come not from suffering, but from structure, discipline, and even comfort. At the time, I did not have words for it. All I knew was that every night, as I lay on clean sheets and listened to the quiet breathing of hundreds of men around me, I felt torn apart. One part of me was grateful, another part was ashamed, and between those two parts I could hear the faintest whisper, perhaps we were wrong. That whisper frightened me more than any bullet ever had. At the time, I could not make sense of it. Why would the enemy treat us this way? Why would they feed us, clean us, give us coffee and music? It was not mercy. Their faces showed no pity. It was not friendship. The guards never let us forget that rifles were always pointed, that escape meant death. For months, I lived in confusion. Each new routine deepened the mystery. Roll calls, meals, hygiene checks, laundry schedules, everything ran like clockwork. The Americans did not shout unless necessary. They did not strike without cause. To them, order was enough. Only later, years after the war ended, did I begin to understand. It was strategy. The Americans did not seek to break us with violence. They sought to manage us with system and structure. They wanted to prevent disease, keep discipline, and show the world that they obeyed the rules of war. Their methods served many purposes at once. I remember the day I realized it. It was after a visit from men we later learned were from the Red Cross. They toured the camp, inspecting the barracks, the kitchens, even the showers. We stood stiffly in formation, watching them. The Americans guided them proudly, showing the clean bunks, the stocked storerooms, the laundry building with steam pouring from its roof. We were part of the display, living proof of American power, not just military power, but industrial power. In that moment, I understood. We were being used, not in the way I once feared, not as slaves, not as subjects of cruelty, but as evidence. Evidence that America could capture tens of thousands of enemy soldiers and care for them, feed them, clothe them, while still fighting a global war. Evidence that America's strength was not only on the battlefield, but in its factories, its farms, its organization. The realization cut deep. Back in Japan, we had been taught that our strength lay in sacrifice, in the willingness to endure what others could not. But here, the Americans showed us another kind of strength: abundance. They had enough food to give even their enemies bread and coffee. They had enough medicine to treat prisoners' malaria. They had enough machines to wash our filthy uniforms and return them cleaner than we had ever seen. It was not kindness, it was power. Among us, debates raged on. "They do this only for show," one officer hissed. "When the war is over, they will discard us like trash." Another argued, "They do this to weaken us, to make us forget Japan." But I began to see another layer. The Americans did not need us to forget. They only needed us to exist as proof of their system. Every clean shirt, every cup of coffee, every bar of soap, they all said the same thing. This is what America can do, even for its enemies. It worked. Slowly, against our will, it sank into our minds. Some prisoners began to admire the enemy, though they dared not admit it aloud. Others hated them more, resenting the comfort that felt like poison. For me, it was both. I hated the way they stripped away my identity with rules and routines. But I also could not deny the awe I felt at the sheer scale of their order. There was one moment that remains etched in my memory. I was standing near the fence when I overheard two guards talking. One said, "These men aren't dangerous as long as they're fed." The other laughed, "Hell, we got more food than we know what to do with. Feeding them is nothing." Feeding them is nothing. To them, it was true. To us, it was unthinkable. Back on the islands, men had died gnawing on bark, fighting over scraps of rice. Here, the enemy could feed thousands of us without hesitation. That was their real weapon. Resources so vast they could afford to treat prisoners well. Years later, when I read about the war from American books, I saw it confirmed. The camp system was designed to prevent unrest, to avoid disease, to project an image of fairness. But it was also a quiet weapon of propaganda, both for the outside world and for us, the captives. Every day we were confronted with proof of America's might, not in bombs or bullets, but in bread, soap, and order. That was their strategy. To conquer not only our bodies, but our beliefs. To make us question what we had been taught. To force us to see that the world we came from, of scarcity, of sacrifice, of blind obedience, was not the only way. At the time, I fought against the thought. I told myself it was lies, a trick, a mask. But in the silence of the night, lying on clean sheets, I heard the whisper again. Perhaps we were wrong, and that whisper was more dangerous than any enemy rifle. Decades have passed since those years behind barbed wire, yet the memories remain sharper than I sometimes wish. I am an old man now. My hair, once shaved by American barbers, has turned white and thin. My hands tremble not from fear, but from age. And still, when I close my eyes, I return to that strange world of captivity in America. People often ask me what it was like. They expect stories of cruelty, of hunger, of beatings. That is what they imagine when they think of prisoners of war, and sometimes I almost wish I could tell them such stories. They would be easier to explain. Suffering is simple. Pain is straightforward, but what we endured was something different, and in many ways more difficult to carry. I tell them about the female barbers, about sitting stiffly in the chair as clippers buzzed across my scalp, shame burning my face. I tell them about the cafe, about the bitter taste of coffee, and the strange music that lingered in my mind. I tell them about the laundromats, the steam rising from the building, the soap scent clinging to my uniform. And when I describe these things, people frown, confused. That doesn't sound so bad, they say, but they do not understand. It was not about comfort. It was about what those comforts meant. For us, every haircut, every clean shirt, every cup of coffee was a reminder that the world we had believed in was crumbling. We had been taught that honor came from hardship, that suffering was strength, that death was better than surrender. Yet in that camp, the enemy showed us another way: order, abundance, routine. They broke us not with chains, but with cleanliness, not with hunger, but with bread. For years after the war, I carried shame. When I returned to Japan, I felt the stares of those who had never been captured. To them, I was less than a man. I avoided their eyes. I hid my memories. I told no one about the coffee, the soap, the music. It felt like betrayal to admit that, in the heart of defeat, I had found something that resembled relief. But as time passed, and as Japan rebuilt, I began to see those memories differently. Our country transformed. We became a nation not of warriors, but of workers, builders, and creators. We embraced order, discipline, and routine, not as punishment, but as a way to rise from the ashes. And when I watched factories hum with life, when I saw trains running on time, when I smelled the soap in my grandchildren's freshly laundered clothes, I could not help but think back to the camps. I realized that what I had once seen as humiliation was also a glimpse of the future. The Americans had shown us something, even if they had not intended to. They had shown us that strength did not always come from suffering. That power could lie in systems, in abundance, in the ability to maintain order even in the midst of war. It was a lesson I hated at the time, but it was one I could not forget. Even now, when I drink a cup of coffee, I pause. The bitterness on my tongue carries me back to that wooden table in the camp cafe. I see the faces of my comrades, some angry, some broken, some quietly grateful. Many of them did not live to see old age, but I did, and with each sip I honor them, even in the strange way memory allows. When I fold my clothes, I remember the first time I held a clean uniform again, the soap sharp in my nose, the fabric light against my skin. I remember the tears of the man who whispered, I had forgotten what it meant to be human. This reminds me. His words still echo inside me. And when I hear music on the radio, any music, even the simplest song, I think of that day when Bing Crosby's voice drifted across the camp, making us feel both comfort and confusion. That sound carried across decades. It still does. What is the legacy of those years? For me, it is complicated. I cannot call it kindness, because kindness was never their goal. It was strategy, order, discipline. Yet I cannot call it cruelty either. It was something in between, something harder to define. It was a reminder that war is not only fought with weapons, but with ideas. That the battlefield is not only soil and sea, but the human spirit. We were defeated soldiers, yes. We were prisoners, yes. But in that camp, we also became unwilling students. We learned, against our will, that the world was bigger than the code we had been taught. That perhaps there was strength in things we had despised. Comfort, cleanliness, routine. I have lived a long life since then. I have seen Japan change. I have watched my grandchildren grow in a world unscarred by the jungles of Saipan or the barbed wire of America. And sometimes, when I tell them pieces of my story, they listen with wide eyes, unable to imagine such a world. I do not tell them everything. Some things remain locked inside, but I hope they understand that war is not only about victory or defeat. It is also about what survives inside us after the fighting is done. For me, what survived were the shocks. The clippers buzzing against my scalp, the bitter taste of coffee, the soap on my skin, the order of the enemy. Strange legacies, perhaps, but they are mine, and they remind me every day of the truth I once resisted, that even in captivity, even in defeat, the enemy found a way to change us without firing a single shot. Now that the years have carried me into old age, I find myself telling this story more often. Perhaps it is because I do not have much time left, or perhaps it is because the world seems to be forgetting what war truly was. Young people today imagine battles in terms of dates and victories, not in the quiet humiliations and strange mercies of captivity. They cannot imagine what it meant to sit in a chair while a foreign woman shaved your hair, or to taste coffee for the first time in the uniform of the enemy. Sometimes I ask myself why these memories, of all things, stayed with me most sharply. Not the battles, not the sound of artillery, not the days of marching through jungle heat, though those memories are there too. No, what comes back to me again and again are the small, ordinary things inside the camp. Soap, sheets, music, bread. Why? Because they forced me to see the war differently. We had been raised to believe the enemy was a beast, a monster without honor. We believed America would torture us, starve us, laugh as we died. And yet, they did not. They did something far more dangerous to the spirit. They showed us their abundance, their order, their routine. They showed us that their power did not come only from weapons, but from a system that could even absorb its enemies without breaking stride. This realization haunted me after the war. When I returned to Japan, I struggled to speak of it. How could I tell my countrymen that the enemy had fed us better than we had eaten in the field? How could I admit that my body had grown stronger in captivity than in battle? These truths felt like betrayal. For many years, I locked them inside. But as Japan rebuilt, factories rising, trains running, families returning to normal life, I began to see echoes of what I had once despised: cleanliness, routine, abundance. The very things that had broken us in captivity became the foundations of our new nation. Slowly, my shame turned into understanding. Perhaps the lesson we had learned, unwillingly, was not a curse after all. I do not glorify my captivity. I do not call it kindness. The Americans were not our friends. We were their prisoners. But in that relationship, I saw something I had never seen before, a different vision of strength. Not the strength of dying bravely, but the strength of living systematically. Not the honor of suffering, but the dignity of order. Even now, as I sit with my grandchildren, I sometimes tell them small pieces of the story. I describe the bitter taste of my first coffee. They laugh, unable to imagine a world where such a drink could be alien. I tell them about the laundromat, about the steam rising from the building, about the first time I smelled soap on my clothes again. They wrinkle their noses, pretending to smell it too. Then I tell them the truth. That war is not only fought with bullets. War is also fought with ideas, with systems, with the way one nation chooses to treat even its enemies. I do not excuse the war. I do not excuse the suffering on either side. But I carry these memories as proof that power can take many forms. For us, the captured soldiers of Japan, the greatest shocks were not the gunfire or the chains. They were the clippers, the coffee, the soap. And, perhaps, in their quiet way, those shocks taught us more than the battles ever did. If you ask me now what I learned in those years, I would say this: suffering does not always make a man strong. Sometimes it only breaks him. And dignity does not always come from defiance. Sometimes it comes from accepting that the world is larger, stranger, and more complex than we were taught. That is my legacy. Not victory, not glory. Only memory. Memory of a time when the enemy showed me, without meaning to, that there are other kinds of strength. And if you take anything from my story, let it be this: do not wait for war to teach you such lessons. Learn them now, in peace. Cherish the small things: clean clothes, warm food, music drifting through a quiet room. For those, too, are victories, though they leave no medals behind.